we have our closing keynote that I am super ecstatic to introduce. And I'm glad that y'all are buzzing. Give me 1 second. Let me just get my paperwork ready for. So to close out, we have Dori Tunstall, who will be sharing many concepts, ideas, and practices of decolonizing design. If you didn't know, Dori has been doing this design thing for a really long time, but also her practice expands not only through the lens of Western society, but also really going deep into like indigenous societies in Australia, in Canada, but then also coming back to the United States. I would say through reading Dori's book regarding decolonizing design, I learned so much about my practice, made me reflect on what does it mean to really think and hold the space for decolonization, and where should that start? And so I'm so ecstatic to step aside and let Dori really show us new ways of thinking about our relationship to design, how that affects others, and how we're holding and creating spaces to truly do the work and not just use the term decolonize design.
Nu is so much taller than I am. So Nu did the land acknowledgement, but I always put it up as the first thing in every presentation that I do all around the world, which becomes really funny because like you'll be in Finland and you're talking about the way in which the Finnish were colonized by the Swedish and the Russians, or you'll be in the UK and talking about, actually I was in Scotland about a month ago and talking about like how the Scottish were colonized by the English, and then when they became part of the UK, like colonized everyone. So it's really important to be grounded in a sense of place, but Nu did a really good job, so I'm just gonna like, again, recognize. For some people, because everyone seems to be confused as to where I'm living now, so I am a guest in lands that are inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tatavariam, Serrano, Kish, and Chumash peoples, and I honor and pay my respect to their elders and descendants past, present, and emerging as they continue their stewardship over these lands and waters. And I am Elizabeth Dori Tunstall, daughter of Teresa and Joseph, daughter of Raymond and Letha, granddaughter of Dolores and Johnny, granddaughter of Betty and George, great-granddaughter of Katrina and Raymond, and descendants of other ancestors known and unknown. Ashe. Thank you. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, on the land of the Catawba, Didi, Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicorowacaval nations, and I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, Kashkashia, and Miami nations. And I'm going to talk to you about Decolonizing Design, a cultural justice guidebook. But as I always begin, I do a shout out to an amazing design team. So thank you all for like selling out the book at the book signing. Appreciate that. And let me say why I appreciate this. So the design team is, all the illustrations are done by Enna Aggie, who's a Nigerian-Canadian illustrator. The book cover is by Sadie Redwing, who's a Lakota designer, and the book interiors by Polymote Studio, which is made up of a bi-coastal team of Silas Monroe, who is African plus American, and Brian Johnson, who is of the Mohegan Nation. So this is a Black and Indigenous designed book. And shout out to MIT Press for allowing me to put this dream team of a design team together, because they didn't have any Black or Indigenous designers for me to work with. The economics of why the book is selling out is really important for me, is that as part of decolonization, designers normally in this process just like sign over their rights. And one of the negotiations that we made in like a decolonial framework is that we have profit sharing. So they get a percentage of the profits of the book. Because again, the things that designers are normally paid, right, to design the book, again, it's a thing where that it wasn't as much as they deserved. So by engaging in profit sharing, like we say, there's another way to do this. That as a book, as an artifact, is a collective outcome of community love and support of one another. So in the way that if it doesn't sell well, I lose. But if it does sell well, then they benefit from like your care and concern and profit from that as well. So imagine, or you don't have to imagine, because again, you are all there. It's the summer of 2020, what I call the racial reckoning, where because of the COVID pandemic, many people around the world found out what Black and brown people know every day, right? That the justice system is unjust. And the role of the cops is not always to serve and protect, but actually in some cases they murder, right? In this case, it's the murder of George Floyd. So during this time, OCAD University, where I was the first and only, well, not anymore, actually, the first Black dean of faculty design anywhere in the world. We made our announcement of the outcomes of a Black cluster hire, which addressed 144 years of zero Black full-time faculty representation in the faculty of design by hiring 5 full-time Black faculty in all-in-one swoop. Yes. And so, in the way you're saying, wow, everyone was like, wow, wait, this might be a solution. Dori, what do we do? What do we do? We want to do something. We want to make amends. A lot of companies were like reaching out to me. A lot of new roles given people who are now directors, coordinators of diversity, equity, inclusion were reaching out to me saying, what the heck do I do? How do I work within these institutions? So the book comes out of me trying to do something that allows me to communicate them more than the days and hours that I had to have these one-on-one conversations. And it's about 5 things, which is the answer to questions, what decolonizing design, what it means. And it means this to me. It may mean something totally different from you. But for me, it means putting Indigenous first, dismantling the tech bias in the European modernist project, and I promise I will break that down, dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project, making amends through more than diversity, inclusion, and equity, and reprioritizing existing resources to decolonize, because there's always the money question, right? So chapter 5 is about the money question. I do not have time to go through the entire book with you. So I'm going to focus on 2 areas, putting Indigenous first and dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project, because I think for this community and for the conversations that I've heard in beautiful resonance all day today, these are the ones, this is what you need to hear in order to be able to do the work. So what is decolonizing design? What might it mean? So let me start first with the Chicago story. 1999. The ink on my PhD from Stanford is less than 6 months old, and I and my trusty Doberman Pinscher, Jerry, arrive in Chicago. I was so right that I do not belong in that stuffy old nap town, Indianapolis. I belong to the big city. But not just any city. I belong to Chicago with its hot jazz and cool blues, Black porters and politicians, the famous Art Institute and Field Museum, Calder, Public Art, Mies van der Rohe Design, Post Office, ethnic gangsters, housing project towers, elevated trains, Ferris wheels, veggie Polish hot dogs, Cubs versus White Sox, summer gun violence, 5 months of ice, cold, and salt, trucks, and design within reach. Here, I can reinvent myself, not in the sunny dreams of people of LA, but as a new me, shiny, ambitious, and just a little hard, like the city. The strike price of my Sapient shares is $150. In 4 years, I will be a millionaire and get to make tech that truly benefits my community. And you know what's amazing about Chicago is its vast racial and multi-ethnic character, and it comes with a degree of segregation. Yet there are 65,000 Native Americans from over 175 nations and tribes, making the city the 3rd largest urban indigenous center in the United States. Decolonizing design means putting Indigenous first. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation at UC Davis, and a Patwin elder said to me, you know what, we don't actually like that term Indigenous, because people have been using it to say everyone's Indigenous to everywhere. We're talking about Native Americans. So I changed my presentation and said, decolonizing design means putting Native Americans first. But actually, right, because it is actually decolonization is super local, right? So it's putting Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations first if you're living here in Chicago. Now, what do you mean by putting Indigenous first? Or how do you even get somewhere to talk about that? So I went to go take a job, again, at Toronto, and people were throwing around this term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and POC. Now, for me, this was confusing because, again, I had spent some time in Australia. So when I left the United States in 2009, Black people were included in the notion of POC, right? People of color. The history of it is actually in Chicago, where Black women came together and they were like, these are all the things that we need. And then other women from all over the world looked at that and said, hey, we need those things too. What are we going to call ourselves? Oh, women of color. Oh, well, we should be gender inclusive. Okay, we'll call ourselves people of color, right? So how did Black people get out of the POC? And the way in which it kind of was explained to me was about we have different relationships to the land. So there's a wonderful essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And in that essay, so Eve Tuck and W.K. Yang, they talk about this triangle, right, of positionality in a settler colonial state. So if you are in the United States or Canada or Australia or many other places, mostly up and down North South America, you are in a settler colonial state. And what I mean by that is that at 500 years ago, a group of Europeans came over in boats, decided to build their good life on the land that was, again, inhabited by Indigenous people. That the process of doing that caused a lot of disease among Indigenous people, decimating their populations. And so in order to have labor to work the land, they imported Africans to work as enslaved peoples on the land because they had already had immunity from European diseases because of thousands of years of trade. And so that's the settler colonial state is a place where settlers, people from other places, came and built their good life on the land of other people, and in the case of the United States, Canada, other places, and the labor of other people. So that helps think about, okay, why do we have BIPOC? So with Indigenous people, as we do in our land acknowledgements, they are the original custodians of the land. One of the things that each settler colonial state sets up is this structure of laws And what those laws seek to do is, in many ways, kind of set up policies of assimilation. How is it that people are going to fit into this structure where, again, Europeans are at the top. European white folks who are Christian are at the top. So Indigenous people have been fighting that for 500 years. For Black folks, again, brought to the land, our relationships to the land, if you're a multi-generational African American, your ancestors were brought involuntarily to this land. There's another group that went to the Caribbean, there's another group that went to South America, there's another group that went to like all kinds of other places, but for the United States, right, that, again, brought here as the land. And because the structures of white supremacy are unassimilatable. My name is Elizabeth Tunstall, which means most people think I'm the queen when they're wanting to speak to me on the telephone. My first language is English. I think it's like 86% or something of African Americans are Christian. So in the sense of like a assimilationist program by which a person is forbidden to the point of death of speaking their language, practicing their culture, doing all these sort of things, like African Americans have been put through that grind. And yet, because white supremacy demands a anti, right, it's anti-Blackness. So unassimilatable, which is why we have to go around saying Black Lives Matter. And then for the POC group, and apologies, it's not, again, it is a term that does not reflect all the nuance of identities, where you have Latinx or Latin, you have Middle Eastern, you have Asian, you have everyone else who's not Black or Indigenous or European colonizers, right, in that group. But what it does speak is the way in which, again, their relationship to the land is oftentimes they had to leave home because of colonial activities there to build, as settlers, a better life on this land. And in terms of assimilationist policies, because they are in some ways structured as a buffer, they make really difficult decisions of like, do I teach my children the language? Do I give them an Anglo name for them to fit in order to be able to assimilate into that structure? So that is why the term BIPOC, but I flip it around, so I say IBPOC, Indigenous, Black, and POC, is important because it helps us do probably one of the most important things that we need to do right now, this moment, which is to figure out what is our positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty as the land, as the land. And again, we've been brought into these things really difficult. So Vine Deloria Jr. Has this wonderful book called Custer Died for Your Sins. It's not like the best title ever. And there's a section where he talks about the black and the red. And he talks about, again, the way in which white men systematically excluded blacks from everything. And I'll go deeper into that. But again, because there were like agreements and like, Indigenous people actually like saved them from starvation and all this kind of stuff, that their approach was to turn Indigenous people into Anglo-Saxons, right? This is why you have the residential schools. All these sort of ways, the Anglo-Saxonization of the Indian is the way in which you talk about it. So we've already been put into these different positionalities, and this is the part where I'm going to have a little side conversation with the Black folks. I'll bring us back in together. But okay, Black folks, decolonizing design does not mean 40 acres and a mule. Because you have to ask yourself, from whom were those 40 acres coming? So if you don't understand what your positionality is, that means you can be brought in as a wedge. Right? I mean, we've been watching the television show with all of these Black hands saying no to the end of genocide. So if you don't know what your positionality is, if your goal is to get the bag, but out realizing what's in the bag, what the blood that's dripping out of the bag, then again, are you really contributing to liberation? And again, we get it. We are primed to join in. The process of exclusion says, okay, we want in. We want in. But is this a project do we really want in on, is the question. So one of the things, again, like putting Indigenous first, especially as an African American person, is humbling. It requires a tremendous amount of humility. Because again, as a community, we are used to being like the global voice of social justice. And it was really important for me when I was Dean of Design is to sit down, actually, and listen. And there's some things I'm not very, very good at. I had to learn. I had to learn. And luckily, I was in a very generous and loving Indigenous community who helped me see that by calling me out, it was an act of love, right? So it's like the Patwin elder saying, you know what? We don't really like that term Indigenous because of this, right? That calling out is saying, I love you, and I want to be in a harmonious relationship with you. So I'm going to tell you the thing that you are doing that might harm that harmonious relationship that we are trying to build. So this is the part where it's like, if I decide I want to be in a harmonious relationship, then guess what I do? I change the freaking slide, right? But I'm not always good at it. Like sometimes I really struggle with not being present because the trauma that is experienced in Indigenous communities, Native American community, is not that far off from the trauma that is experienced by Black communities. Like we've experienced, again, dispossession. We've experienced the removal of our children. And so for me, it's a thing where I struggle sometimes just to not get overwhelmed and shut down. And that is a problem, right? Because if I'm in solidarity, I need to be present for their pain, for their joys, for the party, for the powwow. But I also need to be present in their pain. And that's one of the things that I've had to really work on for myself. Oh, the one that always gets me, it still gets me, is like so again, I worked in high-tech consulting, as I talked about coming here to work at Sapient Corporation. Sapient Corporation operated on fixed time, fixed price, which meant I learned project management skills that were the ones that were used by like the top 5 consulting firms. So I know how to make time and task work. I know how to make the trains run on time. It is one of the reasons why I am super, super effective in making change, because I know how to set up the Gantt chart of change. But that doesn't always work, right? Because, you know, many Indigenous communities, many Native American communities, they work on a different sense of time. And sometimes I do not have the patience to work on that sense of time. And there's been situations where I've removed myself from the situation because I was just like, y'all not moving fast enough for me. And that sometimes breaks the relationship. It breaks the opportunity. And it's the one I still struggle with, right? It is one I will continuously struggle with. But as I said, I get called out, and I sit down, and I change. I try to change. Now, we're going to put Aboriginal first because I'm going to talk about Australia. Now, what does this have to do with design, right? Okay, so again, this is the decolonization part. So let's move into the design part, right? Putting Indigenous first from a design perspective means, we need to do a reframing, right? So one of the things I learned working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is like, we could keep the Bauhaus, actually, point, line, and plane, that is very useful, right? These are very useful things because they're actually kind of based on like things that humans see, right? We see like this, we see in point, line, and plane. So we can use that part of it, but what does it mean in partnership, and in this case, working with Dr. Norm Sheehan, who brought Indigenous principles of respect, know, care, and share. What if we take the Bauhaus and in some ways reframe its values so that it is under Indigenous values first? And the amazing outcomes come out of that, right? Because as I will show you later, the Bauhaus projects in terms of like practices, they were okay. The Bauhaus framework in terms of principles was sheet, right? And why do we want to do this? Why do we want to do this? Is that because so many things that have been designed over the last 500 years have been things to enslave us, right? So we talk about our phones and the way in which they capture our attention. But before, in the community, we design objects that transmit liberatory joy to the body and to communities, right? We made things for our family and friends and community, and when we had enough, we exchanged it with other people who needed something that we didn't have, and they had something that we didn't have. Connection. And I did a workshop last week, and people were like, Dori, what do you mean by liberatory joy, right? Like, that sounds really abstract. And I broke it down to them this way. Liberation is when you find yourself in a situation in which you don't have fear to say no to something that will harm you. That is when you know you're liberated. If I can say no to something that harms me, that could harm me without fear, then that's the area in which I'm free. What is joy? Connection, right? Connecting to ourselves, connecting to our community and each other, connecting to the universe, right? This morning, there was so much talk about connection, right? That's where the joy comes from. That's why we love music, right? Music allows us to synchronize together so that we can feel that we are in connection with one another, right? This is where the joy comes from. So wouldn't it be amazing to be in a present future where everything we design is for liberatory joy? That's why we have to decolonize, because colonization separated us, put us in a hierarchy. To dismantle that, that's how we reconnect. So, because I worked in consulting, here's your takeaways. Figure out your positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous, Native American, specifically Ojibwe, Abdiwe, and Potawatomi Nation sovereignty over the land. And that's the correction I need to make it, because again, one of my Indigenous colleagues, Matthew Hickey, said, no, as the land. It is not with overland, it's as the land. Learn the colonial histories of the places where you are. Make mistakes, but also make real amends. And again, this is, I know, that this morning, Trisha said don't do merch, but if I was gonna do merch, it would be like design objects that can transmit liberatory joy to the body and the community. That is, people say like, well, how do I practice this every day? It's like every decision you make, is this leading to liberation and is it leading to joy? And if it's not leading to both of those things, don't make it. Just don't make it, right? That is super simple. Okay, so now let's talk about why we are in this situation, right? I did like the super colonization aspect of it. Let's begin to bring it down a little bit closer, to design. And so I'm gonna read to you a little bit more because again, Chicago is a major player in this story. So my Ethiopian partner and I wanted to move from the Chicago neighborhood of Edgewater to Rogers Park so that he can be closer to Northwestern University. I had called to see it about an appointment, and this was our 4th appointment. So we learned that with my English name Thank you, assimilation, Elizabeth Tunstall. An untraceable continental accent. That we would have no problem getting an appointment. This is different from when we used Muhammad's name and he called to make the appointments. So we arrived at the appointment on time, and a young white woman in her late 30s opened up the door with a toddler on her hip. Her eyes widened in surprise to see that we were Black. I announced my name and that we had talked on the phone earlier, and that I was here to see the apartment. With obvious hesitation, she led us into the flat. Shifting the toddler to her other hip, she began the ante-sale. You know, we don't like parties. We don't like loud parties, she said. A statement disconnected from any topic of discussion. That's fine, neither do we, Muhammad replied, without missing a beat. Also, we don't allow drugs or smoking or anything. That's fine, we don't do drugs, drink, or smoke, I replied. Muhammad and I side-eyed each other. Oh, we really like it quiet here, she announced. And so do we, I stated. Muhammad here is a PhD student at Northwestern, and so he studies a lot. I'm a professor at UIC. 1, 2, 3, we waited for the shift. Oh, Northwestern, you're a professor? Oh, then you will love it here. It is very quiet, and it gets lots of sun, and my husband and I live upstairs, she gushed, putting the toddler down and handing me the application form. With a tight smile, I turned to Muhammad. I think we've seen enough. Yes? He nodded. We walked to the door. Let me know if you have any questions about the application, she called out, standing in the doorway. We gave her tight smiles and walked down the sidewalk. When we were out of earshot, I turned to Muhammad and sputtered in pure rage. That biatch. I fucking hate racist Chicago. Chicago is known as one of the most racially segregated cities in North America. There's actually an index for that, with 100 being absolute segregation, and Chicago has an index of 80. And this is by design. According to urban historians, Chicago invented modern segregation. And this shows that the second theme of the modernist project and design is a lie. The promise that if you give up your national and ethnic identities, you can join a universal humankind. In the eyes of this potential landlord, it is only my partners and my advanced education that allowed us to even see us as potentially human. Before that, we were a cluster of Black stereotypes for her, with the threat of bringing loudness, drugs, and drama into her home. The promise of giving up your national and ethnic identities to join a humankind was only open to white Europeans. And in this section, I will demonstrate how it was a failed project in Europe, which only succeeded in North America and places like Australia because of white supremacy. So what am I talking about when I talk about European modernist project and design? So previous iterations of these conversations, I kept talking about like Western culture, Western this, European culture, European this. And the European faculty at Oak University said, actually, Dori, that's not true. We don't practice this the same way in Europe in the way in which you're describing it. Like, we've moved beyond that, right? So I had to like reframe my language to say, okay, I hear you. So it's a project, a European modernist design project, which again may have stopped in Europe, but is still operating, and it's especially operating in Chicago, right? And this is a myth that we told ourselves, that design is something that happened in Europe in the 1800s, and that through technology and technological progress, the masses will have access to a better life, better living through technology. And by removing allegiance to ethnic and racial markers, one can join a universal humankind. But I will tell you that this is a lie. This is a lie. It's a lie. It's such a painful lie. But where does this myth come from? So I like to look at actually world fairs. And this particular lie starts in 1851 in the UK. Surprised. And the lie is boldly written, right? So forgive me, those who are truly English, but I'm going to put on my fake BBC accent for this one. Let us all earnestly pray that divine providence, which is so benignly watched over and shielded the illustration of nature's productions, conceived by human intellect and fashioned by human skill, may still protect us and may grant us the interchange of knowledge resulting in the meeting of enlightened peoples in friendly rivalry, may be dispersed far and wide over distant lands, and this by showing off mutual dependence upon each other be a happy means to promote unity among nations and peace and goodwill amongst the various races of mankind. It sounds so good. Let's continue. Because then you get a few pages down and it starts to sound like this. The productions of those who are commonly called Aborigines, or the less civilized races, are substantially inferior fruits of human industry. Oh, I should have done a trigger warning. Trigger warning. The highly civilized man, rendered by science familiar with the works of uncivilized people, will soon come practically to and to aid in their superior qualifications that shall rightfully place them among his level. China and India have so much in common with us in their manufactures, their arts, and their agriculture that they have made so much progress already in many respects that purely Aboriginal products are comparatively few in those countries. They ruined it, right? Didn't even have to get 2 far pages, but they ruined it. Because what this is talking about is called the Great Chain of Being, in which Europeans were at the top, Asians were in the middle, and then everyone else was not even on the chart, right? Par for the course. And you think, okay, this is the 1850s, racism was in fashion then. But look, this is the QS World Rankings, and guess who's at the top? England. And then you have, the products of English education in the United States as a settler colonial state. And then, Asia clocks in around the 10s and 20s. I think in this one I have Mexico, right? That's clocking in at 45. There are no African institutions that are on this list. You mean to tell me in the entire continent of Africa that there is not an institution of making of art and design that, again, would rival any of these other places in the entire world? So, Houston, we have a problem. We have a problem. But let's go to our beloved Bauhaus, because I told you, they are useful. I'm not going to read this page. Cliff Note version, okay, the early finders of the Bauhaus were white supremacists. But again, at the time, most Europeans were white supremacists, so let's cut them some slack. Because what they were really trying to do is basically design things for men who had experienced physical, emotional trauma from World War I. So the idea of let's have the white walls, that's to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea of let's get rid of our German and our English and our all these different French designs and join neutral Swiss design. That's again because 6 months, a year, whatever before, they were actually fighting real Germans, real English, real French. And so, user experience, they had their user well defined. White men who experienced spiritual and physical trauma from World War I. The problem is we made this the universal standard of design. which meant that if you are not a white man who had experienced spiritual and emotional trauma from World War I, the standard of design is not designed for you, right? And actually, all the magazines, all the institutions, all the exhibitions that try to push you in that way is trying to assimilate you into that particular aesthetic, which comes from a time and the place, but is not a universal standard. And again, that means we made as our universal standard of good design something that has a white supremacy problem at its roots. And so let me explain to you what white supremacy, like one of the shocking things I realized is that white supremacy has a time and a place. Time, 1681, place, the Colonial Assembly of Maryland. And scholar Jacqueline Badalora talks about that basically white supremacy rose out of there was a Bacon's Rebellion in which indentured European servants, freed blacks, and enslaved Africans all got together to overthrow their aristocratic European overlords. Now, it wasn't all like sunshine and whatever, because they were overthrowing them mostly also to get access to Native American land, right? But for me, the ideal of like before 1681, there was so much solidarity amongst quote unquote the oppressed that they had to enact like 50 years of laws to break that up. Says, a white supremacy that says, white people can't marry other people, black and Native people. You can't set Africans free. Free blacks can't hold public office. This was the most interesting for me. Like, you cannot whip a Christian white servant naked without special order of the justice of the peace. And then enslaved Africans and free blacks are prohibited from having guns. So like you had to set up this whole structure to break apart that solidarity that exists. Which means there's a time and a place where the separation that happened because of these laws can be repaired. That solidarity can be built again. And that's why it's important to understand that white supremacy has a time and a place, because it also has an end date. So the problem with white supremacy, so this is actually where the Christian white bodies, whatever, actually becomes really important, because what white supremacy does is to protect white bodies, white choices, and white voices. And the work of designers who are not white men who were traumatized by World War I, is that we actually have to claim our stories of making. And this is happening, right? So again, gender bodies are being claimed, and these are like latest books. Again, bodies with disabilities are being claimed. Indigenous and racialized bodies are being reclaimed in design as a subject, object, and future of design. And the interesting thing about this group of books, these are all released in the last 5 years. All in the last 5 years. Actually, if we want to be super accurate about it, they were actually only released since 2020. And it's not just about bodies, but it's the values that need to change, right? Because again, as Tema Okun says, white supremacy is the water that we swim in. Which means, like, again, just because you have black and brown bodies raising your hand at the UN, it doesn't mean that white supremacy structures have gone away, because it's the culture values, right? That is seeped and built into every single institution. And it is these values that need to be dismantled when we talk about decolonizing design. So, summary point. But let me bring it down to you something tangible because we are at the MCA, so I wanted to show this example, right? Let's make it real. So when I was Dean of Design at OCAD University, the Royal Ontario Museum was putting together an exhibition called Canadian Modern. And they had, and the story that they were telling was like, okay, a bunch of Europeans came over from Europe and they established like the Canadian design industry, the entire Canadian design industry. But again, there were some people there who were like, we're not sure that's the true story. And they brought me in, because again, we're just next door, down the street from the ROM. And so they're like, Dori, what can we do about this story to disrupt it? And they were like, can we, maybe we can get some students involved, and we put like a little poster or like a little sort of, thing in the side. And I'm like, what? Y'all a museum, y'all about objects. Let's put some objects into the exhibition. And so we did a call. OCAD has an amazing Center for Emerging Artists and Designers that put together the call. We had amazing panelists. Look who's there, helping to select. And this is the face of Canadian modern design. These are the faces of Canadian modern design. Meet Anthea, who is of Greek and Indian background, which you can see in the jewelry that she designed. This is Effie. They do work in industrial design, and they did this wonderful project, again, using chairs to talk about the way in which we structure genders, right? This is Rachel Leung, who is an immigrant from Hong Kong to Canada. So through the graphic representation talks about, like, first of all, that journey, which now happens by airplane instead of by boat. So that's been updated. And you see in the designs, like, motifs and colors and things that are both representative of Hong Kong and Canada. This is Stephanie Singh, who is of Jamaican heritage and does these amazing material vases that are made from the pulp of materials that are found in Jamaica. So yes, there is marijuana pulp represented there. And this is Kalalelo Sitole, who is of Zimbabwean and royalist. So again, if you don't know what the royalist is that when the War of Independence happened, Britain said they were going to free the slaves. So a lot of black people were like, we're on the side of Britain. We want to be free. When Britain lost, they actually had to leave the United States and go to Canada. And so they all went to mostly the west coast of Canada, and they were called like the royalist, the black royalist. And so she's of this heritage, and so the quilt patterns that you see is actually from a dress. She turned it into a dress, but it represents motifs that are both from the quilts of the royalists and then the symbols of the Indebele. This is Dan and her, I can't read, Herchan, and Pi Wang, who again are speaking to the natural landscape of Canada. And so this is, again, like a file divider that matches the curves of the Athabascan mountains. So this was all scattered all over the exhibition. We did a talk, a podcast kind of talk, a video podcast kind of talk, and many people said that like this was the most exciting aspect of the exhibition. This intervention in the story of Canadian modern design to include the diversities that exist within Canada and again, the people who represent the future of those practices. And it was really cool to hear the students and the recent graduates talk about like inviting their family to come see their exhibition in the Royal Ontario Museum, for them to feel acclaim over notions of Canadianness that aligned with who they are. This is how you decolonize design. So, okay, like I said, I worked in consulting, so here's the key takeaways. White folks, you need to do the work of healing from your own intergenerational trauma. Like I said, a month ago, I was in Scotland, and I literally had people shook because I asked the question, why did your grandparents and great-grandparents get on a boat to come over to United States, Canada, all these other places in the world? No one leaves home unless it's a matter of life and death, right? And they responded like, oh, we hadn't asked those questions, right? But that's the work that has to be done because, again, it's that unresolved trauma. That is the reason that harm is being inflicted onto others. So do the work, heal your trauma, heal people, again, hurt people. And there's a lot of hurt that is happening. Those of us who've been excluded, we have to claim and reclaim our stories of making. That was the beautiful thing, right, of this conference today, is that this is a conversation about a community, a set of communities, and I'm still using the community word, claiming and reclaiming their stories of making. That is Deem, right? Claiming our stories of making. And for the design firms and institutions and community organization and leaders, we have to cede space to those who are non-white, non-male, non-able-bodied, non-Christian, et cetera. And again, you know, like I say, the work of decolonization is the work of white folks. They set up the structures, they have to tear it down. The thing is, they cannot do it alone because they can't see the pain points in the structure, right? It works for them, right? So we need to work together. I could tell you every single pain point, right, in the structure. But the thing is, I've been excluded, so actually, I probably don't really know that deeply how the structure works. But guess what? If you are the top of that structure, this is white men, I'm talking to you. This is your work, right? This is your work. You know how the structure works because it works for you. So we have to work together because I can tell you where the pain points are. You can tell me where's the exact point of leverage in that system that we need to dismantle to build something that actually creates harmony, justice, fairness, liberatory joy for all of us. But I do help. I'm helpful, right? So this is the plug. So on Wednesday, so those of you who are like saying, oh, what is it that I need to do? Let me help you. Let me help you. Help is on the way. It's here. I've been working, if you follow me on Instagram, you know I've been working for the last couple of weeks preparing these 3 courses that I'm teaching in partnership with CalArts. The first one is Whiteness Without White Supremacy. It opens up on Wednesday. Please take this class. And I say for 2 reasons. One, the problem that we are facing, the greatest problem that we are facing today is the desire for groups of people to maintain a structure of white supremacy, patriarchal chaos in the world. And I always tell people we are in the last gasp of that dying system, right? Because we know it doesn't work. Like, it pollutes the environment. It creates social injustice. Like, if you are over in Hawaii building bunkers on indigenous land, right, to protect yourself from the rabble-rabble of all the people who are going to rebel when we can't have clean water and all these sort of things. Like, the best thing to do is address the white supremacy that allows that. And again, this is not talking about white people. It's not white bodies. It's a culture. It's a culture, right? And so the first work is getting over that addiction to white supremacy, right? And it's the hierarchy that it's creating. That's what we're dismantling, the hierarchy that it creates. The second course is hiring for decolonization and cultural justice in the creative industries. So again, I know like a lot of industries, people are not hiring right now, like they're just trying to get rid of people in order to improve shareholder value. But this is the time to do the work, to understand how you build the cultural competency to truly embrace diverse communities, because no industry is going to survive by excluding 99.9% of the rest of the world, right? And lastly is business transformations for cultural appreciation, not appropriation. And so this is the thing, it was like, okay, I can tell you, how to not cultural appropriate, but let's talk about the systems that actually lead to the fact that you think it's okay to culturally appropriate. And the way in which, if you want to embrace diverse communities, guess what? If you are paying people on net 60 days after they've done the work, that's exploitation, right? So you are not truly embracing community if you're not paying people for the work that they do, right, during or closely related to the time in which they've done the work. Because I don't know anybody whose bills come on net 60, right? And then, again, like how do your legal systems and all these other systems, again, prevent you from embracing the cultural communities that you need to embrace in order to survive? So these are the courses that will help you take the next step in doing the work. Because normally after this, everyone's like, oh, Dori, I'm so inspired. I'm so inspired. And it's like, I am so happy to inspire you. That's why they put me at the Endnote, right? Because you go out there and you're like, all right, I am ready to change the world. Okay, these are the steps by which you can begin to do the work to do that, right? This is the steps. So what does decolonizing design mean? Putting Indigenous first. The original sin is colonization. If we are just wanting to join the system and not understanding its corruption from the core, then again, we're not doing liberation. We're not doing liberation. Dismantling the tech and racist bias in the European modernist project. Again, I know y'all missed the tech one. This is the one where you have to read the book, but like I said, it's the underlying consciousness of things that's the problem. That it's operating on a white supremacy system, that's the problem. Making amends through more than diversity, inclusion, and equity. So there's a big attack on DEI right now, but what I say to you is DEI happened before it was DEI. DEI will continue if they make us change the language to describe what DEI is. And the work that is being done is, again, my critique of DEI is that a lot of it is that, like, let's join in. We want to be part of the system, right? Like I said, decolonization is on a different tip. It is saying, is this a system we want to be in? Like we had presentations today. It is possible to build a world that is not based on capitalism. It's a hard work to be able to do so because you are definitely pushing against the tide, right? But it's the work that community has been doing. So how do we tap into that and expand that? And then the money question. All budgets are finite, every single one. So it is always a question of what are you prioritizing within that finite budget? There is never a money question, there's just a money prioritization. What do you think is important? I would say decolonization is important, right? Because we are seeing the billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars that is being spent to stop it from happening, right? So I know that I've left you with so many questions, but I can't get the slide to move. There we go. So again, reach out to me. I tend to respond fastest on Instagram, but all social media is ephemera to me. It goes in one eye and out the other. So if you mean business, send me an email, because that's business. That's the business channel for me, right? LinkedIn, you know, if you wanna hire me for projects, help me help your organization, then reach out on LinkedIn, because that's when I really am business. Like that's my corporate me, right? But I'm Dori Tunstall. Thank you for engaging with me on this difficult journey of figuring out what does it mean to decolonize design. Thank you very much.